Some of the menu items that I find I'll be using in the very beginning of these sessions are, besides tool menu and document, which we briefly covered, we have some of the things that are around the work area, which we should take the time and go over. So I'll just drag out a sphere here, hit T for edit, and we might as well hit X and make this a Polymesh 3D. I want to get into the habit of that. And let's look at some of these things. So once we start sculpting, the controls for a brush are located up here at the top middle menu. So we have Z add, that has to do with the Z intensity, which is the brush strength. So it's default set to 25, which is a nice number, I think. I may, in some cases, want to turn it down a little bit more, so it's like less sensitive. And this is going to react both ways. When you're holding Alt and pushing in, that setting doesn't change. And so if you notice that when you have a brush and you're holding Alt, you're actually inverting the function of the brush. It's the same as hitting the Z sub. Z sub should never really be selected. You should just hold down Alt. So we have Z add for the brush strength pulling outward, and then Z sub, and then the Z intensity is the actual brush strength, so we can use this more or less how we want it. Focal shift, if you notice on the brush there are two rings. There's an outer and inner ring. That's basically the fall off of the brush. So if you change the focal shift, you notice the inner ring becomes larger or smaller accordingly. This is the fall off of the brush. So the hot spot would be the middle inner ring, and then there's some fall off to the outer ring. So this I hardly mess around with. I just leave it pretty much where it is. And then of course there's draw size, which is the brush size, and that can be accessed a number of ways. A lot of people like to use S. S will call up a little floating menu so that it's really wherever you want the brush to be. Pretty nice. But it's always here up on the top, and what I like to do is actually not use any of those menus up on top. I like to just basically right mouse click, pen click, sorry, and it calls up this menu that has many of the things that you'll be using. So you can actually ignore the top menu and just change a draw size here, your focal shift, the Z intensity, color, material, and so on. We'll get to that. There's also spacebar. Spacebar will bring up that same menu, which is pretty convenient. Your fingers are right on the keyboard at all times, so pressing spacebar is very easy, as opposed to coming all the way up here or finding S. So we have the active points, which we briefly gone over in one of the other sessions, and there's the total points. So just to recap that, active points are whatever you're actually dealing with at the moment, and total points has to do with all the polygons that are in your project file. So if I open up Subtool and I had copies of this, if I hit duplicate, you notice that the number will double in size because we have two objects, and this one is currently at 8,000 and you got 16 because there's two. But one of the other things is if we start dividing this object, which is Control D, adding a subdivision level. Let me go and hide the copy. Control D, you notice that suddenly we've gone from 8 to 32 because we quadrupled the amount of polygons here. But if you Shift D, go down a level, you'll notice that it's back to 8,000. But the total points are including the subdivision levels, the copy, or anything else that's in the subtool palette. So your total points will always reflect how many polygons you have, combining subdivision levels and actual objects in the subtool palette. but your active points will only be what you're working with at the moment. So if I'm at subdivision level 2, it's at 32,000. If I shift D and go down a level, I'm at 8,000, a quarter of that. Very handy, the ability to go up and down subdivision levels. We'll get into that a little deeper, but I just wanted to explain active points and total points a little more. Okay, so we go back over now next to ZAdd, and we have M, RGB, and mRGB. Now, this is pretty straightforward. M is material, RGB is color, mRGB is material and color combined. And then you have RGB intensity below that. So if I turn on RGB, I suddenly have this RGB intensity slider available to me. Now this works much like the Z intensity. When you're using a standard brush, it can be a paintbrush as well as a sculpting brush, as long as ZAdd and RGB are selected. So you can actually do two things at the same time. So I can make my material, for the sake of illustrating this, let's go to whiter or lighter material. Let's go to basic material, and I'm going to fill this object with material and color so it doesn't change on me. So I'm going to go color fill object. Once again, we'll go back over these things in detail, but I just want to explain these three functions right here at the moment. So by going to mRGB, I combined a quick flood of color, so it's actually white now, and there's this basic material applied to this object. So my material is a basic material and the color is white. So if I switch to RGB, which is only dealing with color, and I turn my slider to red, my brush is ready to paint color on there. But it's also doing another thing. It's actually sculpting. So you can see as I keep dragging over this object, and even if I invert the function, I will invert the color. It's using this back color, which is black, foreground color is red, and I'm actually sculpting and painting at the same time. It's handy in some cases. I hardly use it that way, but there are some situations where it does help to have color and sculpting happen at the same exact time. But let's say we were just all done with our sculpting and we wanted to paint. All we would have to do is turn off ZAdd, and now you're just dealing with color, and so now you can just paint color without sculpting. So I change my color and paint over. Now this is where we could understand why RGB intensity has a slider, is because it's opacity. So we can go and turn down the color green and actually paint with a more opacity, so that the red is actually showing through and we're mixing on the surface. And if we want the paint to be completely opaque, we turn it to 100, and there we have solid opaque green color there. And now M by itself is material, and you can switch and paint another material, but this creates a strange effect because it only fills each polygon with material color. So unless you have a very dense mesh that you won't even really notice the polygons being painted in, because there's such density to the mesh that it blends, this is not necessarily a good idea. Or if you have objects that have a clean line of separation and you can paint up to that line, but we're actually painting with material color, so we're combining a standard material that was already applied, and we're actually painting in this metallic material. So there you have two different materials mixed on there. And we can easily go back to RGB and choose a color and maybe turn down the RGB intensity, and you can paint over the metallic here. And there's your painting controls pretty much, just using a standard brush and adding the RGB feature. If I want to switch back to sculpting, I can turn off RGB, switch to Z add, and then I can continue sculpting. Then right next to that we have rotate, scale, and move, which we already kind of touched on, which is WER, transpose tools. So notice that when we choose move, scale, or rotate, we also have this Gizmo 3D. Like currently we're using this icon or this gizmo right here to rotate the object. There is another function, which is the transpose bar. If I deselect this, we have a completely different kind of function, which is, let me go right back to that, which is the transpose bar, which it's a really awesome tool, but very difficult to learn in the beginning. So I would kind of shy away from this for a little while and just mess around with the Gizmo 3D rotator and translator, because it's a lot easier and it's very familiar if you're using or coming from something like Maya or 3D Studio Max. Most programs will have an icon that looks similar to this, where you have translation, handles and scale and rotation. So that's it for this top menu. The live boolean is a little bit more advanced. We'll get into that. And then we have Lightbox, which we know that it pulls up a menu that allows us access to files, projects, materials, so on. And we were turning that off in the beginning of the project. And then home page, we don't really need to get anything from the internet right now or look at anything. So we pretty much covered everything up here. And it's pretty useful stuff here. If I got into customizing, I probably wouldn't get rid of any of this stuff right now. Maybe just Lightbox or homepage. And that's it for now.